What's up, everybody? Thanks so much for joining us for our second conversation of the week, community conversation. We started this series on Monday with a conversation around the sanctity of life. If you want to go check that out, you can learn more through our Facebook page where you're watching this. It's also available on YouTube. The rest of this week, we're going to have a couple more of these tomorrow at noon because of a time zone thing. I'm going to have a conversation with Sam Albury around sexuality. And then at 8 o'clock on Friday, I'm going to have a conversation with a friend of mine named Javon, who is a bivocational Black church planter in Seattle around race. So I'd love to have you guys continue to join us for these conversations this week. Our hope has been, how do we have the conversation even about issues that we don't necessarily all agree on, but that we can find the heart of God that is both conviction and compassion, like we talked about this last weekend. Tonight we have joining us the one, the only Rob Kelly from Compassion International. Rob and I actually traveled to Guatemala earlier this year, and just so appreciate his heart and seeing the way he, through compassion, really serves the global poor. So really interested in his perspective as a global poverty perspective. But then this is really a dual conversation because for many of us, it's about, hey, we're in the city or we're driving down the street and we see poverty as it manifests itself in the United States. And Doyle Robinson's with us. He is the founder of Sox Place, a youth homeless drop-in center in Denver. And so thank you guys for being here. Thanks for being willing to give up a Wednesday night for an hour. Appreciate you very much.
That's good.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I asked the question to the group as folks watching that have joined us already, and they're starting to answer it. But I'd be curious for you guys, where was the place that you first witnessed poverty in your life?
I think for me, it was when probably in ninth grade, high school youth group, we served some people in Denver, and I encountered a bunch of families that basically lived in these little motels, and that was one-room motels, and that was actually where they lived. And I had never even really thought of that, contemplated that, or considered that, but to see a family of 5 or 6 just living there was probably the first time I encountered that. Wow,
that's a powerful experience. How about for you, Doyle?
Yeah, I really saw it in my own family, cousins, aunts, and uncles, a lot of kids. That's where I really first experienced it firsthand. Was seeing the struggles that they had. So
wow.
my own personal family is where I saw it at.
That's a really unique perspective. I remember for me, I took a group of students to actually Guatemala years ago when I was a youth pastor, and I had done some travels into Mexico and done like some mission stuff, but it was the first time that I'd been to Guatemala. And I remember what really struck me was we had landed in Guatemala City. We spent the next morning in Antigua. And I remember thinking when we get there, like, man, Antigua's kind of rough, And then we ended up in the Ixil Triangle for the week, serving an amazing school down there. And I just saw like depths of poverty that I had never seen before. And it was, it wasn't even, I didn't have a framework for it at all. And I'm like trying to experience it myself and help students experience it. And where it really stood out was by the end of the week, we traveled back through Antigua to get to Guatemala City. And I was like, oh, this place is like a resort, And it was just like, what a difference a week had made in my thinking because of what I had a chance to watch. So I think those are really, really powerful experiences when you first see that and all those assumptions that you've made kind of get shook up a little bit. We got some folks watching. Rob, what's up, buddy? It says that for him, it was in the Army when he served in Honduras. Rob, thanks for your service, man. I'm sure that had to break your heart and trying to process how you serve that community and from inside. I can't imagine. Shannon said, hey, I remember I was probably in 8th grade and we went to serve dinner at the local homeless shelter with our church. What a cool experience. But I think, if we don't have those experiences, you just kind of wonder, when would you have seen it the first time? And what were those expectations that you were going to carry with you even longer than that? Mike said, when I went to Mexico as a kid and there were kids begging on the street. Absolutely. Anthony's just giving me a little sass. He says, blue checkered church worker required. Where is yours, Phil? That's true. We said, I've branded it actually plaid for poverty. So let's start a thing. I do have this, so I feel like I'm at least within the color scheme. But yeah, Doyle and I personally, like I'm not saying there's a conspiracy, but I think Doyle and Rob left me out on purpose. So it's going to be fine. I'm going to make it. Carrie said mission trip to Juarez in college with IVP, or InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Carol, good to see you. Glad you're here. Vicky says, good morning. I don't really remember the first time, but the most recent time that really hit home to me was when my son was doing a project on it and he just wasn't getting it. So we took him downtown to where his dad works, and it shocked him to see the people on the streets right outside his doors. We drove around a bit more, and it was eye-opening to see the whole families and little children out there. Obviously, Doyle, that's kind of your stomping ground, man. We'll get a chance to talk about that for sure. Liz said, hi, I knew the conceptuality of poverty as my mom went on mission trips to Uganda and shared photos from her trip when she came home. I'd also seen homeless people downtown, but my first meaningful experience with poverty was 5 years ago when I went to serve at Mean Streets in the hotels on Colfax. I wept all the way home that night when I realized the magnitude of it. It's exhausting. Like when you realize how big it is, especially at a global scale, it just feels, yeah. Jeff Jameson, by the way, says hi, Doyle. So
hey, Jeff.
There you go. Huntsville, Alabama in the mid 70s. Greg, what's up, buddy? Lisa, when we lived in Oklahoma in a smaller town where you were either a have or have not, but poverty took a whole new look when I went to Zambia last summer. I can't imagine. Jeff, taking the church bus to pick up poor kids in a certain neighborhood. What a different experience I'm sure that was to what we see now. Greg says, but the worst was in India during a business trip in 1978. Ben, OKC rescue mission as an 8-year-old, and then junior high mission trip to Dayton, Ohio. Jeff also serving in a trailer court church as youth pastor in my late 20s and early 30s. Mackenzie said about 2 years ago, driving through a town my son's biological family is from to have a visit with bio siblings, a small town in Florida. Wow. That is, thanks for sharing that, Mackenzie. Mark, I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where poverty was everywhere. It is a little better today. Brady said, serving homeless in downtown Phoenix with my youth pastor. I did that. We did it where I would take students down and we made sack lunches in Seattle. And it was, it was so eye-opening and just amazing to see the hearts of students care for people that were so different. And Peggy says, hi, in high school, serving meals at a rescue mission in downtown Phoenix. Hey, look at that. You and Brady. Cassie, good evening, y'all. I think the first time it really hit home was when I went to Hollywood on a mission trip. Hollywood isn't what people think it is. Certainly parts aren't. Absolutely. And then we got a couple more. I'm going to post just one more, and you guys can keep commenting. This is really thanks for sharing these. Aaron E said, I saw homeless people on the streets as a kid, but it really hit home when, as a teacher, I would have students who were considered homeless or live in a motel. I can't imagine as a teacher just knowing the kids are going, oh my gosh, I can't imagine that. Wow. Well, thanks so much for sharing and giving us a little bit of insight. I would just say this, these are conversations. So we're going to talk, and I'm going to ask Rob and I'm going to ask Doyle some questions that they know are coming. No gotchas that I know of anyway. We'll see though, the plaid shirt thing, I'm remembering that. And then if you guys have thoughts, questions, just drop those in the chat too, and we'll incorporate your feedback into the conversation as well. But before we get started, I'm just going to pray for us, if that's all right. God, thanks for today. Thank you so much for the chance to be able to, through technology, have this conversation. God, I'm just so drawn to this passage. You say, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me. And God, I think we live in a moment where it's really easy to live lives in a way where we can push so many of these conversations we're having this week out of our mind. And poverty is one of those. And God, I just pray that what breaks your heart would break our heart, and that this conversation and the heart of these two men would shine through. Thank you so much for their willingness to have this conversation. In Jesus' name, amen. Yeah. Well, hey, Rob, I'd love to start with you, man. Would you share a little bit about your own story and kind of how you grew to specifically have a passion around this? And for folks that don't know, I think I mentioned it, you're at Compassion, kind of how your story intersected with Compassion.
Yeah, man, great to be here. Appreciate these conversations. I think I kind of grew up probably, a little below middle class, typical white neighborhood. Heard about poverty, thought about it a little bit, but it wasn't really part of my life. Eventually, I was leading a church, and we started tackling issues like this locally and globally. And probably the first time I really started to dig in and see, what is going on in our community, what's going on around the world. And for us, I think kind of a turning point is we were looking for a way globally to connect our people to a person in the world and a place in the world. So there's kind of a deeper relationship, and Compassion International really gave us the opportunity to do that. And for us, I think as a church, we're saying, well, I think a lot of my people, along with me, are saying, well, we kind of know, why we're supposed to do something and what we're supposed to do. But the question kept coming back, well, how do you do it? And who can you trust? And for us, Compassion really, again, filled that gap because we vetted them, determined we could trust them. It was pretty simple that you could sponsor a kid, in a sense, really disciple a child that was living in poverty from afar and be a true help to them. And so I was all in, got to travel, kind of internationally and see poverty firsthand, which, broke my heart. And our church started making some huge strides in just being generous in that, involving themselves personally. But then there was one instance where I kind of went from really getting it to really, really getting it. At least I think I did. We were down on a trip in Bolivia, and I'd been down there before. I was standing in a home, and I was holding this tiny little girl who was about 4 weeks old. And I was just holding her tiny. She was healthy, but really tiny, weighed about 5 pounds. Talking to the family, lived in a very compromised housing situation. And I was just talking, and I asked the mom, I said, what's this little girl's name? And she told me her name was Clara. And at the moment, my wife was also on that trip. I didn't dare look at her because I'd been crying, blubbering, crying, because 4 weeks earlier, our very first granddaughter was born, and her name was Clara. And so you have like 1,000 things go through your mind at the same time. I was thinking, here's 2 little girls that were born almost exactly on the same day, just in different parts of the world, and the trajectory of their lives, through no effort or fault of their own, looked very different. And I think there's something in that cemented me, and our church really became involved in doing more things. And then eventually, I didn't know at the time, but it led me to working with Compassion and connecting churches with opportunities around the globe.
Man, that's an amazing story. And I do think at the global poverty scale, there's so much of this conversation that just feels like this little beautiful girl had nothing to do with where she was born or when she was born or what she was born into, just like, your granddaughter didn't. And so there's something of that does one of them really deserve to live in poverty? And like, what do we do about that? And what does God think about that? I think, man, such an amazing perspective. Really appreciate that, Rob. Doyle, for you have a super unique experience, right? For folks that don't know, I'm so excited for you to share a little bit, kind of a high level of your story. But for you have this unique passion for homeless youth in our city here in Denver. Share a little bit of how you grew to experience that passion and then ultimately begin Sox Place.
In the early 90s, when I was a youth pastor in Springfield, Missouri, I read an article about street kids in the Parade magazine newspaper insert. I don't know if they still have that or not, but it was about street kids in Portland. And after reading it, Phil, I uttered a quick prayer, and I was just somebody ought to do something. And God responded back with, I agree with you. That was really kind of one of the beginning points of recognizing that there's a subculture out there that I had never heard of before. We didn't really have much of that in Springfield. Very long story coming to an end to Denver, but this is where we ended up. I started going out on 16th Street Mall, doing what I called street ministry, but not street preaching. That's just not who I am. And I always try to tell people, God will use you who you are. You don't have to change into this or morph in or to this superhero to do ministry. It's just doing what you can at there. So I had it at Sox. That's what I found out they needed. It was easy for me to get children's churches and children's ministries and churches, youth groups, organizations to donate socks. And that's what I handed out, which gave me an in with them because they may not talk to me, but they'll say, yeah, I'll take a pair of socks. So I was there 1 week, 2 weeks, 10 weeks, 52 weeks, 2 years, 3 years, just doing the same thing. Providing clothing when I had it, providing groceries when I had it, just whatever they needed. Because mine was, we all hear the WWJD. Mine is WWID. What would I do if Jesus walked up to me and asked for a pair of socks? Later on, you ask him, say, and it's everything I do. What would I do if Jesus walked through the door of Sox Place, where he knocked on my front door? What would I do and how I would respond? So, short of worshiping them, we try to do the same thing for the street kids in the poverty. I felt drawn away from local church youth ministry. I wanted to go where they were not being reached. Urban America is where it was happening. So, God brought us to Denver. We started Sox Place because there wasn't one. There wasn't any place for them to go to in the afternoon. So we rented a building by faith, Phil, by faith. It was $2,500 a month then, and I thought we were stepped off the ledge at that point in time. Now it's $5,400 a month in 18 years.
Wow.
But God has provided. So we opened it up because there was a need. The needed something to be done in the afternoon. And now we feed anywhere from 60 to 100 street kids and young adults each afternoon, feeding a lot of people.
Wow. Well, I think, I don't know if everybody caught that. 18 years.
Yeah.
Like the amount of just sheer endurance in ministry, man. Like I've watched people flame out of ministry in like comfortable, cozy suburbia in a handful of years. Well, you endure every day, man, because of that initial prayer. Man, somebody ought to do something about this. God says, I agree. That's amazing. That's an amazing story. Well, Rob, I'm gonna ask both of you this question, but Rob, I'm gonna ask you this question first. What do you feel like are the primary needs of someone at a global scale that's experiencing poverty?
Yeah, a big part of it is access. Things like food and water. It's opportunity. So that could be education, that could be jobs. Those type of things. And then I think a big part of it too is protection in all of its ways. There's protection from physical harm. Sometimes there's land issues. One of the big causes of poverty globally is just that things will work out where people just lose their land. And they have, in that case, they lose their livelihood. So just protection there, especially women and children, they are extremely vulnerable for a number of reasons. And so I think all of those things, which in a sense are more tangible, but I'll never forget when I gathered, almost 12 years ago now, gathered a group of pastors together down in Bolivia. And I asked them that question. I said, man, what are your biggest needs? What do you need? And they did mention, resources in various ways. They did mention some protection things and stuff like that. But what they started with and what they ended with and what they emphasized was just this idea that we need encouragement. We need to know that we're not alone. And we need reassurance that our hope isn't in vain. And that always stuck with me, that the very things that they most needed were actually something that literally everyone can give them in some manner or some way. And it really emphasized just that importance of that relationship. And so it's not that those other things aren't absolutely crucial, but I learned a lot just in that, hour-long conversation about the importance of those non-tangible things, if you will.
Well, we talked about this on Monday as we were talking about the sanctity of life, that all these things are connected, right? And so the sanctity of life to a follower of Jesus should not just be, we want to save babies who aren't born yet. Like we want that, but we should also be deeply concerned with the state of poverty around the world, because what we keep saying, right, is that everyone's created in the image of God with infinite dignity, value, and worth. No matter how much money they have, no matter where they live, no matter what else is true about them, that is the most foundational truth about them. And I'll never forget, man, we were together in Guatemala, and I don't remember the place that we were. You guys told us the day after that it was more dangerous than you had led us to believe. And we were with a pastor who had taken over for his dad. And it was like just amazing. He shared, it was awesome. Like we're all a mess, like praying for him. And I remember he gets to the end of the conversation and he said, we're like getting ready to leave. And he's like, hey, what can I pray for you guys about? And we're all like, wait, what? Like, I think wait. And he said something. He said, yeah, I hear in America, some people are so poor, all they have is money. And I was like, well, that just tore my soul in half. So thanks for that. And I think it does just reshapes your understanding of, hey, there is material need, but there is a diminishing return of material need that you can have a point at which it's like, well, more is not always better. And so at a global scale, that's a really good perspective, man.
Yeah.
Doyle,
you just said that just in like a lot of our children over the last couple of months, the amount of letters that have come from them to their sponsor, and almost all of it is, are you healthy? Can we pray for your health? Can we pray for your well-being? Can we pray for your medical condition, for your medical needs and all of that? And these are people coming from where those often don't exist, wanting to make sure that, the people that live in environments where they are actually have access to that. So it's pretty humbling, but also beautiful.
I met our sponsor girl when I was down there, and it was incredible. And she sent me a letter last week, and she asked that exact question.
Yeah,
like, hey, everybody healthy? How can we pray for your family during all this? And I'm like, for our family? Like, holy smokes. So, Doyle, how about for you, man? If you were to think about this from a local urban perspective, what do you feel like are the primary needs of kind of the urban poor that you interact with on a daily basis?
I've got about 2 pages of notes on that very thing.
Sure. I'm sure you do.
A lot of what we see, Phil, is, and we've heard this term, it probably doesn't mean or is impactful as it used to be, but the breakdown of the family. I read an article or a book by Dr. Ruby Payne in her book, A Framework of Understanding Poverty. An incredible read, by the way. I mean, very, very informative and very, very, very good. A working definition of poverty is the extent to which an individual does without resources. And we look at what she calls them assets. Family support. So what I see is first of all, they need somebody to believe in them and accept them. They're in poverty, but poverty is not their issue. It's the poverty of the soul. It's the poverty of the heart, their spiritual life. We see those that are ready to give up because they don't have anything to support them. I talked to a couple of young men, one I've known for a long time, one I met for a short time, but I looked at both of them. I looked at one of them and I said, Angelo, I believe in you. And man, he got quiet and he kind of hung his head down. He said, oh, we never hear that. We need to hear that from people. Another young man, he said, Doyle, you're the only one that's ever believed in me. Some of it is just an acceptance of who they are and where they're at without judgment. And that's hard for us to do, Phil, is to withhold judgment. We've never walked in their shoes. We don't know what it's like. We say we're poor, but we have more clothes than so many people do. They need family support, job skills, transportation, housing. And housing is not the problem. I get so tired of hearing the media that housing. You house an addict, they're still going to be an addict. You house a violent person, they're still going to be violent. It's addressing the needs that cause them to act the way they do. What has caused them to be in poverty? What has caused them to be without housing, without transportation, without money, without a job? So what we try to do is to meet that basic need of acceptance. We just accept them for who they are, where they're at. We've had them come in and say, I'm pagan, I'm agnostic, I'm atheist. Cool. You need a pair of socks. You need something to eat. And sometimes when they know that we're Christians by word of mouth, they're shocked. They're waiting for an argument or a sermon. So one of the things that we see so much of is giving them hope in the middle of the darkness. They come to Sox Place and it's a safe environment. And it's safe physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. We don't allow people to come in with condemning and intrusive sermons that they want to preach at these people. We need mental health issues. Well, we don't need them. We've got them. We need solutions. We have a part-time counselor, retired social worker at Sox Place that I put kids in touch with. Someone to believe in them, Phil. I mean, that's because until they get that solved, their heart's not going to allow them to do anything else. I hope that makes sense. And yes, they need food, they need clothes, they need housing, they need all these things. But you can have all those things with an empty heart or an empty soul, and it doesn't do them any good.
Totally. When I think one of the things that feels different a little bit when I think about the difference between like urban poor versus global poverty is that when I interact with people that are in a different country and the socioeconomics are significantly different, typically they're different for everyone in their community. So it's like, hey, we all live in houses like this. we all experience food like this. We all like it's the same. And I would think that for the urban poor, the dignity that you're talking about is so important because they live in the contrast of the haves and have-nots every moment of every day. And so being able to start to work against that narrative that says I'm not worth it, I don't matter, no one can care about me. And you guys don't know this if you don't know about Sox Place, but the heart of Sox Place is to really connect the father's love to the fatherless. And I think that is all about that idea of dignity. So I really appreciate that, Doyle. That's a great perspective.
Thanks. Yeah.
So Rob, here's my next question for you. I think for a lot of times in Christian world, especially with global poverty, the answer is kind of like, just write a check, just give some money. And so maybe just talk a little bit about, certainly we're not dispelling the need for financial support and the responsibility that all followers of Jesus have to be generous. But why is just writing a check not enough for followers of Jesus to address the poverty of our world?
Yeah, I appreciate what you said there. I think, there is this whole side where a generosity that is financial makes a huge impact. And it really is a big deal in a lot of ways. But for some people, that's the easiest thing to do. And it really requires the less of them as opposed to the most of them. And so I think when I think about addressing poverty, I think of kind of, the Bible kind of lays out that, what we're kind of being transformed toward is this idea of shalom, right? Where there's this wholeness as to who God created us to be fully. And I think for a lot of good reasons, it just went kind of sideways that the church historically has kind of said, well, if we can just get people up to a certain economic level, then yay, we've conquered poverty. But poverty is so much more than that, even as Doyle expressed. And so I think what I go back to is that all of us are gifted in different ways as the body of Christ. And we want to use those gifts in various ways to support the entire body, to build up another person, to build a relationship with another person. And I think behind that, then the generosity that comes all of a sudden has a deeper meaning. It's part of this bigger relationship that occurs. And then maybe the most important thing, and I hear it all the time, is through compassion, through other organizations, ministries, people thought they were stepping out to rescue somebody. I'll just use that word rescue. And at some point in that relationship, that involvement, they'll come back from mission trips. You know what? I was actually the one rescued. It wasn't them. And so there's something that God wants to do in and through your heart when you're an agent of hope, when you're an agent of justice, when you're an agent of mercy, when you're a conduit to those things, that God wants to do things in your own heart. And I think when we sort of remove it from being personalized, or we take the relationship out of it, then we're actually missing out on some things that God wants to do in us and through us, let alone what he wants to do to the people that we're trying to serve and help.
Oh, that's a great perspective. And I think, the child sponsorship program of Compassion and programs like it are so unique because they do allow that. It's not just dollars. I think the sad part is when you're in there and you're like meeting kids on the ground in country and they're like, you're talking to them and you're like, hey, so like, have you gotten any letters from your sponsor? And they're like, no. And I'm like, can you give me the mailing address of your sponsor so I can go talk to them? I'm going to write them a letter, so right. Like, what are you doing, man? And then the kids that did have sponsors that would write them letters or send them stuff, and they have all of them. Like, it is like a prized position. It was amazing. And it's exactly for the reason you're talking about. That's really helpful. For you, Doyle, like, what about from an urban poverty perspective, another place that is probably pretty easy to just kind of like write a check, financially support? What do you think? Like, how would you answer somebody if they were like, hey, why can't that just kind of be enough?
Well, first of all, we need finances. I don't know if I mentioned it or not earlier, but our rent's $5,400.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But it's much more than that. Jesus modeled our behavior. He said, whatever you do to the least of these, you've done to me. And I think that not only means food, water, clothing, acceptance, but it's how you treat them. Do you wave at them when you see them flying? Flying a sign means they're standing on the corner with a sign in their hand, and they're asking for money. They're asking for all kinds of stuff. Most of the time, it is for drugs or alcohol or a motel room. Sometimes they will get 5 or 6 people together to get one motel room to get out of the weather. They need a physical representation of Jesus Christ. I think one of the things I found out when I first came and started walking the streets is that God's been misrepresented. A lot of bad things have happened in the name of God, and a lot of things have happened to these kids by the local church. They smell, they stink, they talk bad, they listen to bad music, um, all kinds of the stories. So it's much more than just writing a check. Write a check, but bring it to us. We've got one donor that he'll do that. He'll just come by and give us money, drop off. How's it going? Talk to a few of the kids. He knows what he's paying for or buying. He's investing his money in something he sees. These kids see that. They recognize, hey, somebody believes in Sox Place, therefore they believe in us. They're supporting Sox Place, so they support us. So the physical act of being there. Now, some people can come in. We've got groups and individuals from Eastern Hills that come in, and they're nice and relaxed, and they can interact with the kids, and the language and the conduct doesn't bother them. We have some. I remember one lady, she said, "This is not for me. I can't do this. But I have a lot of friends that are like me. We're highly educated, good jobs. We want to do something. We want to be involved. But coming down here is just not for us." She started doing fundraisers for us with friends and family in our neighborhood. Uh, we've had people that come down, and all they do is organize a pantry and clothing closet or hygiene room. Others will do coat drives, food drives. There's all kinds of ways to be involved. You don't have to be physically there. In fact, there are some we don't want there. They're not any good interacting with the kids, but they're great at organizing things. So, like I said, to me, Jesus taught us. And one statement that will never leave me is one that Jordan, my youngest son, he and I started Sox Place together. He said, "Dad, let's just do it like Jesus did."
Hmm.
He walked among the crowds. He talked among the crowds. He taught on the fly. Uh, Everyday happenings were teaching moments, and he loved people regardless. So, um, write a check, but bring it physically, if I can say it that way.
That's
And
great.
I cannot fear Rob. So if I repeat it or whatever, I apologize, but I can't hear him on this.
Oh, so well, he said some really profound stuff. So just take my word for it. Doyle, Debbie said, to be the body of Christ, we need to be both people who can donate and people who can serve. And I think I've heard that from both of you guys, that there's this way that God has made all of us. And he's asking us to serve and be involved in the things that are close to his heart in the way that he's made us, not to be somebody else, but in the way that he's made us, not to be comfortable, but to recognize how he's built us. So, Rob, as you kind of think about this conversation, just a reminder, if you guys are watching and you have comments or questions, thoughts, just drop them in the comments. But Rob, how would you respond to somebody who thinks that many of the people at the kind of, that are poor in our world are essentially poor just because they're lazy? Like, how would you have that conversation with somebody where that's their perspective?
Yeah, I'm not proud of this, but I kind of grew up in a family, hardworking, blue collar. And so I kind of learned that growing up. That was my thought for the early years of my life, was like, well, if someone's poor, they're just lazy. As I came to engage with people, build relationships, travel different parts of the world, even throughout Colorado, found out how untrue that is. I mean, certainly we have people that are lazy in all industries. We have people that are lazy, that are wealthy, people that are lazy, that are poor. But I think the thing that kind of strikes me is just that it's virtually never a lack of initiative. It's almost always lack of opportunity. There's just not an opportunity. And interestingly, I think some people, like I have a couple of friends that work in the oil and gas industry right now. They don't have jobs. I have a couple of people that are pilots, and they basically barely have jobs. They're not working right now. And they're some of the hardest working people that I know. But if you didn't know more of their story, you'd say like, well, gosh, they're not even working, but they're not working because there's not the opportunity to work right now. And in places of poverty, there just isn't usually a lot of jobs, and the jobs that do exist typically are not salaried positions. They're a day's wage for a day's work. And so when I was down in Ecuador last year, and a perfect example is a hardworking guy. He'd worked basically on this farm for a number of years, and he was working a plow and he broke his ankle, and he no longer could work. He was no longer getting paid. And so people might look at that and say, well, there's someone who is lazy, but the reality is he has a physical injury and there was no safety net, if you will, to take up for what he was lacking. And that's more common. What you see is just really a lack of opportunity, not a lack of initiative.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. How about for you, Doyle? I think obviously, Rob's talking a little bit about some of the dynamics that exist for folks that are kind of day laborers around the world that are in places where it just takes kind of one small event for that to change radically for them. When you hear somebody say, well, I see people on the corner, they're asking for money, they're just lazy, they could just go get a job. How do you help people like that maybe think differently about the people that they come across, created in God's image with infinite dignity, value, and worth, that are flying signs?
Yeah. I used to be much nicer in my response to that question. It's a real sore spot with me. It's touchy for me because I know some of these kids. And my first response is always a question. So you know these people that you're talking about. Second question is, so you know their stories. You know that they woke up at 6 years old one morning and said, I'm looking forward to being raped by my grandfather or my caregiver. You were there when they woke up one morning and said, I'm going to be an addict to meth and heroin. I'm going to be homeless today. I can't wait for this. This is what I planned my whole life for. They weren't born into safe homes like your children are, Phil, like my sons were. They're born into very dangerous situations, and we turned a blind eye to that because we didn't want to do anything about it. Because if we see it, if we know it, Phil, then as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, we have to make a decision what we're going to do. And it's either help or ignore. And if we ignore, that's not what Jesus taught us to do. Jesus taught us to be involved in people's lives. We talk about community and relationships. You got to do something. Sometimes it's just simple. We had one girl come in and she said, I was raped by my mother's boyfriends. She had other men come in and have sex with her child, not a teenager, a child, for drugs. How are you going to live after that event? Are you going to be normal? She's in poverty. She always is asking for something, need diapers, need wipes, need cat food. And it's like, there's a part of me that I get frustrated with 20, coming up with 22 years in downtown of hearing this kind of thing, but they don't have the emotional development. They don't have the skills as a human being to make the right decisions. So they're stuck in this cycle. And so mine is always, do you know the story? I've got kids at Sox, I call them kids, but they are to me, that I'll call them lazy. I'll tell them, you're lazy. You just don't want to work. But I have a relationship with him. I have a relationship with her. They trust me. They love me. We got this great relationship going on. I can tell them up front that that's the truth. But they're far in between. Most of them simply do not have the emotional makeup, the skills to make the right decisions in life.
Yeah,
Are they
no.
lazy? I don't know. I don't know if they're. All I know is they're broken and they're very, very damaged. But we've had kids come through that have gotten jobs. Jordan has a side business of commercial demo, that he's hired young men from Sox Place to teach them how to be on time, work hard, have good attitude, all these things that most of us have been taught and know, but they've never known that before. They've never been born into a good situation. I saw it in Mexico when I went on a trip to an orphanage. It's the same dynamic. People, your caregivers, the people that are supposed to take care of you, have abandoned you and thrown you aside like a piece of garbage. So it's a real sore point with me. I
Yeah,
want
no,
to
it's
slap people because it's like, so let put you in their shoes, in their life. I'm sorry.
I would just add on to that, or affirm that.
But that's what I see. That's what I see all the time. Is if you see Jesus standing on the street corner, flying a sign, need food, need money. What are you going to turn on roll down your window and go, hey, you lazy bum, get a job?
yeah. No,
What would I do if
that's a good
Jesus was
perspective.
flying a sign? So yeah.
Rob, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I was going to say that kind of the years as a pastor at a church, and plus what I've seen globally and just working in different environments, usually when a person chooses not to work, if you kind of trace their story back, you find typically they've been on the receiving end of a misuse of power in some way, some abuse or some of the horrific things that Doyle, talked about, and that's compromised their ability to kind of function in what we would probably term a normal way. That you go back, it's like, wow, someone had power, it was misused, and in a way that damaged them, and so much so that it's hard for them to, hold a job or know how to function with other people, things like that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and I wonder too, I mean, I think about this in terms of folks that have a different faith system, like when I have a conversation with somebody that's unchurched, or especially people that are de-churched, like church was painful for them. And I try to just have a conversation to say, look, like I'm not exclusively a product of my environment, but I'm not going to disrespect you. Like, I'm pretty sure there's a pretty high likelihood that I would believe the same things that you believe if I had experienced the same things that you experienced. And it sounds a little similar in terms of like, hey, when I interact with someone, whether it's urban poor or I'm interacting with somebody in a global poverty, it's like, hey, I can't judge your life and your circumstances based on my life experience. Like that's just a mismatch. And so being able to take a step back and say, hey, the call of God on all of our lives is to love people well. And I think Doyle, Debbie affirms your perspective, right? That this idea of we get to love people and share life with them, it allows us to talk to them, and we kind of earn the right to be able to be a voice, especially kind of in the urban poor context, because they've had so many people that have tried to just kind of churn through and move on. And I know, Rob, that there's a tendency even at the global poverty level for churches, honestly, like us, to be like, hey, what's the best bang for our buck? How quickly can we get this done? And this is really hard, which leads me to my next question for you, Rob, which is how does generational poverty show up in the context of global poverty, kind of where you serve? And how do you give people a vision for changing if they've experienced this for generations, Rob? How do you give them a hope that it can be different for them?
Yeah, a big part of it is helping in a way that is sustainable. Again, historically, the church has done a lot of really, really good things. The West Church, but probably an area that ultimately wasn't helpful is we would do things that just weren't sustainable. And so it was like this quick infusion of resource in some way, but then all of a sudden it wasn't gone. It wasn't, sustainable. And within that, there's not the dignity that needs to be there. There's not partnership, if you will. There's not skin in the game in the whole thing. And I think that really, changes things. But I think it goes back to some of what we talked earlier, is where you're doing things that is going to instill hope. Hope is poverty, probably the ultimate thing that it does is it destroys hope. Poverty, in a sense, abuses and it lies and it tells us that you're not worthwhile and that it's always going to be this way and those things. And so there needs to be an infusion of hope, which goes back to that personal relationships, what goes back to that connection with the reality that, man, you're a child of God who loves you. And then I think what happens is beginning to love them, beginning to encourage them, accepting where they are. It's not a they and us thing. It's an us thing, and give them that respect and that dignity. But what's really exciting is when you start to see it take hold is when there's maybe a young person who's 15, 16, and they look around and they say, okay, what I see isn't right, and I want to do something about it. And I want to be an agent of change in my own community. And that's where you really start to see things happen. But sometimes without this outside influence, there's not a vision for that, what that could really be. It's like, well, this is my great grandfather was this way and my grandfather, and this is just the way that it is. And so you have to begin to give them a vision of that, what happens. And again, connecting them back to a local church, connecting them to the gospel, and kind of letting I don't want to use the gospel, the gospel, letting it do its thing, right? It's not just this, okay, great, we got the salvation thing, but it actually works itself out and in through the life of a follower. And then that works itself out beyond them. So attitudes change, what you do with your stuff changes, how you think about theft changes, how you want to help other people changes, all those types of things. And Yeah, and and you see it happen. The compassion. The very quick version of the story is, it started by a man, Everett Swanson, in what's South Korea, and where he just started an orphanage there. And people back right after the Korean War would have looked at South Korea and said, "Man, this is a no-hoper place, right?" But someone started loving the children, started taking care of the children. They grew up with that love, that hope, that support. And you look at how South Korea is now. I mean, they're by most accounts sending more missionaries per capita into the world than anywhere else, and the church is thriving in a lot of ways. No one would have thought that 60, 70 years ago, but that's actually what happened. And so I think even practically moving away from their stuff is just, I would argue that not at the exclusion of others, but boy, a focus on children, a focus on young people, on students, that there's a great return on that, because that starts to turn that tide a little bit.
No, that's great perspective. And I got a feeling for you. So Rob talked a little bit, Doyle, about how when you invest in kind of the next generation, give them hope, there's a chance for there to be kind of a breaking of some of this mindset around generational poverty. I'm just curious what you would kind of how you would think about this in terms of the urban poor. How do you help them have a vision if this is the second or third generation of poverty they've experienced in some form or fashion? How do you help them see that they can start something different?
Let me tell you a story about a young man that came to us several years ago, third generation gang member out of LA, wound up in Denver because he was running from the authorities out there. He His first job was watching guns at a card game while the adults played there. His second job was dealing drugs. That's the only job he'd ever had in his entire life, was selling drugs. When he came to us, we were nothing alike at all. Our ethnicity was different. Our background was different. Everything was different about us. And we gave him a job in our silkscreen business. Didn't do well. Was frustrated. We had to teach him how to work very simple jobs, and deal with his frustration when it didn't go right. We always have a Christmas party every year, and every year I read the Christmas story, and then I say our Father's prayer over them. And right after the reading of the story, and then before the prayer, I always tell them, "Said, hey guys, we just want you to know we love you, we care about you, we're here to serve you. This is about you; it's not about us." And this young man was standing in the back, and there was about 100, 150, 15, 20 kids there. And he was standing in the very back, and he walked out the front door, right in the middle of what I was talking about. And so I grabbed him later. I said, "Man, what are you doing? Why don't you walk out on me?" He looked at me with tears in his eyes. He said, "Doyle, I've never heard that kind of stuff before. I never heard of a father's love. I never heard about people loving for no reason without wanting anything in return." We see second, third generation. We see second, third generation homeless, addicts, violence, gang, all these. We see those every single day. And again, we're not overstaffed. We're very short staffed. We have very limited times for conversation because of what's happening there within the walls of our building. It's taken time of repetitive action and words. Is that yes, you failed. Yes, you got fired. Yes, this is where you're at. Yes, you seem stuck. I know you seem stuck. I understand that. But this is what you can do. What we try to do is that very core of who we are is that relationship, bringing the Father's heart to the fatherless, not just God the Father, but an actual father. This is what a father would do for his children. Um, we've got somebody brought up about homeless students. At one time, there was 5,000 homeless students in the counties of Jeffco and Adams County. Um, how do you break out of that when you see your mom and dad, or your dad or your mom or some other caregivers living in a car or a motel or even a tent in by the Platte River? How can you get out of that? You've got to have people in your life, and that's where you get laid off from your job. Don't sit there and moan and groan and complain in your home. Go find someplace to volunteer. Volunteer in the schools. Volunteer at a nonprofit. Serve meals. Go hand out socks somewhere. Um, there are all kinds of things to do to break this, but for us, and I don't say this is the only way. This is the only way for us to do it, is to spend that time with these on an intimate, close conversation week after week, month after month, year after year. We shared the gospel with this one couple for 9 years, Phil. 9 years until they gave their life to Christ. And even then,
Wow.
it was an uphill battle. But it takes repetitive action and words to get the truth across that they can change. And that cycle of homelessness, of poverty, can be broken.
That's powerful, Doyle. And I think that there's even a sense when you deal with homeless youth in the city. I think there's a sense a little bit. So many of them are dealing with mental health, have a history of trauma, and so I think in some ways it's like they're testing you to be
Oh,
like, how
yeah.
hard can I push? Like
Oh,
everybody that
yes.
I've pushed has run, so how
Oh, yeah.
hard can I push? And I mean, I just think what's so powerful about the way you have continued to show up for 20 plus years in Denver is that like it does not matter how hard folks have pushed, you haven't run away.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, hey, there's a question for you, Rob, from Greg. He said, how has Compassion's ministry changed because of the pandemic? Are we still able to minister to people, or are we just in survival mode right now?
Greg, I appreciate that question. We are still able to serve and minister like churches here in the States. It looks different. As you may know, our children typically go to the local church in their community, and that's where they receive food, where they receive kind of nurturing, all of the elements of the Compassion program. And really what's happened in nearly all countries is that's become home-based, the best that can be done. As you can, gatherings aren't allowed. And so our workers, a lot of innovation has been developed over the last several weeks. They're going and in a sense, rather than focusing on the child, they're kind of really focusing on the family. They're focusing on communities, whether or not those families are connected to the church or Compassion whatsoever. How do we feed them? How do we protect them? How do we get them the medical care that they need? In certain communities, not in all, but in certain communities, we're able to bypass the typical protocol of how funds are distributed. And at least for this season, the primary caregiver of those child are able to receive the funds directly. Thus, they can get the food, medical supply, whatever they need to take care of them. And so that's really how things are going, how things are continuing. In some of our countries, the whole situation is still rapidly growing. And so it's probably going to be that way for a little while, but we're seeing God do some really incredible things. We're seeing just a spirit of innovation and help. And actually, it's opened up a lot of doors to impacting the community even beyond what we maybe normally would.
No, that's great. That's really good. Well, one of the things that we talked about even Monday around this idea of the sanctity of life was the idea that there's so much kind of connection between poverty and abortion, right? That like that decision oftentimes feels reflective. And so I'd be curious, Doyle, your perspective. Melissa said, this is how sanctity of life and poverty can overlap. Children born into broken situations are in danger. It's a complicated web of dysfunction. And I would imagine, Doyle, for you, you have some perspective not only on watching kids where parents chose to have that child and bring them into a world of poverty, but you're now at a spot, having been for this time, you've watched those kids have kids. And so, I mean, I think I know it's safe to say the answer is not, well, the more convenient option is abortion, but like, how do we step into this messy conversation of this is not the way it should be? This is going to take a bunch of work to try to resolve. But as you think about like little kids in the midst of poverty, that all this is intertwined, what do you feel like are the kinds of ways, best practices, solutions, a path forward that brings hope to as complicated a situation as this is?
Well, one of the things we value life, which means we are against abortion, and I tell the kid, I have no problems telling them that I'm against it, that I am pro-life, that life begins at conception. I have no problem doing that whatsoever, because usually they only come to me when they're in need, which is a great opportunity to share truth. Uh, we are seeing second generation Sox Place kids. And to be honest, they're not any better off really than their parents were. They're so very much like their parents that I see. They're addicts like both mom and dad were. They're promiscuous like their mom was. There are things that are going on that they've learned. It's learned behavior. It's all they've known. It's heartbreaking, Phil, to see new parents walk into Sox Place 2 to 3 days after birth to bring them to Sox Place, and I, they and early on especially not so much later, but most of the time it was here, hold my baby. I want you to hold my baby, and man, you just hold them and you pray under your breath that God will protect them. It's conversations that I have, and it's personal, it's intimate. I don't share it with the whole crowd. I pull them outside, or pull them into a corner, where talk to me. Why are you wanting to choose to abort this child? What's going on in your life that you would want to do that? And it's not judgmental. They know that I'm not being intrusive. They've come to me to ask, and we will share that. We have a couple of pregnancy centers that we go to. One is right downtown, Alternative Pregnancy Center, that we send all the kids to, all the girls to. They get their tests, their prenatal vitamins, physicals. They get everything they need. Uh, I tell our staff and our volunteers, we will not send anybody to Planned Parenthood. We just will not do that. If you do that, I'll kick you out. I'm just That's one of our core values, is we believe in life. And again, it's breaking the cycle. Well, my mom told me to. My boyfriend told me to. Uh, and ours is, what do you want to do? What do you need to have this child? Mine is Phil. You can. I don't know if they do that much anymore, but I used to march around Planned Parenthoods and protest in front of there. And I used to tell people, don't you dare go do that unless you're willing to pay for that lady's or that girl's doctor bills, and make sure you're there to, when that baby is born, that you're there to take care of diapers and baby wipes and powder and soap and onesies and all these things, because you're asking that girl to put herself into a very difficult place of poverty, keeping that child. So if we're going to say keep the child, we have to be there to support that girl and that baby when they're born.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked on Monday about this idea that sanctity of life does extend beyond a baby that's unborn, right? That's all the humans we're talking about right now. And I think poverty is so at the heart of God. And what's interesting, right, is that one of Jesus' very first messages, he said, I've come to preach good news to the poor, and there's this connection we see over and over and over again in the ministry of Jesus, where it's about this awareness of like, hey, the people who are poor, they like understand their need more than people who think that having money makes them rich. And so, man, I really appreciate both of you guys kind of sharing some perspective about ministry that you serve in, and even just kind of your own perspective on this stuff. I'd love to leave folks with just a quick call to action. So Rob, for you, like if folks wanted to learn more about getting involved and what they could do around compassion, I'll drop a link in the chat, and it may be as simple as that, but we just want to give you a chance to kind of direct folks as we finish.
Yeah, you can go to the Compassion website, and there's a ton of information there that you could look at. There's an opportunity to sponsor a child. Just on what we just talked about, there's a program called Survival that really starts with a child, before they're born, and helps that care for that mother and then that child through the first year of life. And it's done through the local church. And so, I'd encourage you to go there. There's a ton of places where you can read stories of transformation, and encourage you to do that as well, just so that you can, I think, be encouraged about what's going on globally, how work's being done through the local church. And then if you choose to be involved in greater ways, awesome. But I think you'd be encouraged by doing that.
That's awesome. Really appreciate that. Doyle, I've already dropped your link in, but for folks that, that are looking for more information, how to get involved beyond kind of just go to the website and check stuff out, what are maybe a call to action or next steps you'd encourage folks to take?
Well, one of the things you do is email me, Doyle@soxplace.com. And one important thing too is be open to what we know. That I can sit and talk with somebody and tell very quickly they're not going to fit into this role at Sox Place. They're going to fit over here. Some people are very open to that, some are not. And Phil, let me tell you this so people can hear this. Leaders lead by example. to me, the best ones. And you've led by example because you've come to Sox Place. You've gotten dirty, man. That room you cleaned up that day. And by the way, it's messed up again. So if you got
I
some
mean, that's
extra
fine.
time, man.
Yeah.
But that's what's important to me is you don't just talk about it, you do it.
Right.
And I encourage all leaders to stop leading from an office, start leading on the streets, leading in compassion, and going somewhere. Uh, so if you want to get involved, or you think you want to get involved, um, give me an email, shoot me an email. We'll set up a time to meet. It may be, through Zoom or something right now, but we can do that. So just Doyle at SoxPlace.com
That's awesome.
or write the checks out to Sox Place.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate both of you guys being here. We're going to wrap up in just a minute. One more opportunity I want to make sure folks know about for us as a church, right? We're in Aurora, Colorado. We have an initiative called For Aurora. That if you don't know this, we cared for a whole bunch of people once a month, just meeting physical material needs in our community. And then kind of as COVID hit, we became an emergency center for Food Bank of the Rockies. We do that for an increasing number of families now every week, give away thousands of pounds of food and supplies, hundreds and hundreds of fresh meals. It's been amazing to watch. And so if you're local, it may be that you go, hey, I want to deal with the needs of people that are wrestling with challenges related to poverty right here in our neighborhood, or someone who needs help, or you need help. You check out For Aurora on social media or send them an email. If you're looking to get involved kind of in Denver, reach out to Doyle. And if you want to learn more about ways you can get involved and help at the global scale, reach out and find out more from Compassion. It was such an amazing trip for me to be able to see Rob's heart and the heart of the team. And I had a really unique privilege to be able to be with Jimmy Miata, the president of Compassion. And I'm not sure that I've ever been with a leader that's that big a deal, that leads from that level of humility and authenticity and integrity. I was blown away. So I hope these are just really good opportunities for anybody watching to be able to take a next step. We have just a few, one more question here. I'll ask you first, Rob. From Eileen, she said, do you have any thoughts or advice on how we can talk about these issues with our children? My son's been asking me about this lately.
Yeah, I mean, depending a lot, of course, on the age of the child, but I think rather than it being an on occasion conversation, that it's just ongoing. And so it can revolve around, a dinner. It can revolve around going to a nice park and just contrasting some of the things which have to be thankful for. And I always I think the key is to instill in your child's heart gratefulness, not guilt. Because out of that gratefulness, probably it's going to spur is just wanting to be generous, where out of guilt, it's going to cause probably, tight-handed generosity. And so I think just having that conversation, exposing the things, and again, I don't mean this as a plug at all, but man, when you have a kid that sponsors a kid and they receive letters back and forth and they get to understand that child's living conditions and how different it is from theirs, that is unbelievably powerful. And so I think, those are good opportunities too. So I would just say, try to have an ongoing conversation, not a once in a while conversation. I think that's good to answer the questions they have out there.
That's great perspective. For you, Doyle, I'm curious, what advice would you give? I would say specifically for our kids when they see someone like in their community or in the city and they're flying a sign and they're going like, Mom, Dad, like what is that person doing? Like, what can we do to help? How would you encourage parents to have that conversation with their kids?
Well, first of all, be honest, but each parent knows their child. When they're 4 years old and ask what's going on, it's a little bit more difficult. My Jordan's oldest son, Castle, he's 5 years old, and he talks about his dad working for the homeless and the poor people, and it's amazing. He knows enough. I would suggest, putting a bag together with a bottle of water, a protein bar, and a pair of socks, white socks. You give them out to people with flying signs, telling your kids at that time. Do it when you're with your kids, and use that. I just believe in teaching moments. All through life, there are moments that provide a great opportunity to teach. When they ask, be honest. And if you don't know, say I don't know. But let's go down to Sox Place. Let's see this personally. Let's get on the website of Compassion International and see what they do, and let's look at these kids and the faces. Talk about it. Get them involved with it. We've had children come to Sox Place. George spoke at one elementary school, and they were like 6-year-olds there in the first grade or kindergarten. After George spoke, about 2 or 3 days later, a 6-year-old girl comes with her mom to Sox Place with her hands full of change she gave to Sox Place.
Wow.
And so you can't think your kids don't understand. They understand much more than they do. So it's just he may be homeless or he may be doing that because he just lost his job. He may do that because his family's sick. There are people in the city that don't have health insurance and they don't have adequate housing. So mine is just always take opportunity to say, so what do you think? How would you feel if you had to stand out there? What would happen if daddy lost his job or mom lost her job? So those are the kind of things that I just, your child, you know what they can handle. Tell the truth. Be honest.
No, I think that's great advice, though. And I think, Rob, you talked about the difference between gratitude and guilt. Like, how do I have gratitude and not let my guilt be motivation? I think that's really true. And I think what you're talking about, Doyle, is really about developing empathy. And I think our kids are living in a world just like we are, where more and more polarized, more and more manipulated by so many different platforms that we're plugged into, that being able to see and put yourself in someone else's shoes, or Doyle, in your case, somebody else's socks. I think there's something so godly about that. So I really appreciate that. I think, the last time that I went to Sox Place and we did kind of just a clean out afternoon there, my 10-year-old was with me. And I mean, we went and had a meal afterwards. And I mean, I could just see his wheels spinning, and it was like, he just, it opened a whole new section of his brain. And I think that is so important to do as parents for our kids. So Debbie, by the way, said that she's happy to take anybody down to Sox Place. She's been there a few times. James says, thanks so much, gentlemen. James is a great guy. So thanks to you, James. Melissa, thank you all for this discussion. Denise, thank you. You're welcome. Kelsey said, thank you, Rob and Doyle. Time to go and send, but not sit. Thank you. That's good. A bunch of different thanks. John said, thanks for the conversation, Rob and Doyle, for your hearts and passion in caring for the poor. And Lisa said, this is an interesting parting thought. She said, it seems like entitlement is replacing empathy in our world. And I think that is a very true statement. Very true statement. It's good. Well, hey, thanks again for everybody checking this out. Doyle and Rob, thank you so much, guys, for being a part of this. Really means a lot. I hope that for families, for individuals, as we think about poverty, these conversations will just bring it back, and we will not feel guilty. I say this all the time around poverty. Don't feel guilty. Feel accountable. Like, God has blessed you. You have been given much to do much with it. You have been born in a situation. You have been born in a nation. You have been born in a moment in history that, as much as we might say things are really difficult right now, we live like royalty compared to the history of the world. And so the way we think about that shouldn't drive guilt. It should drive gratitude. And I think it should drive generosity because of the understanding that we are stewards of the resources God's given us. So I'm going to just start preaching, but thank you guys so much for being with us. Just a reminder, tomorrow at noon, we are going to continue community conversations with Sam Albury right here on Facebook around sexuality. Love to have you join us with that. We continue to want to have respectful, thoughtful conversations with people that agree on these issues and don't, that we can be a place that continues to have good conversations. So thanks for checking this out. Thanks for being a part of it. We'll see you guys again really soon.
Thanks, everybody.